The exchange of power happened slowly but steadily through the years. This wasn't a bad thing, but it was an unprecedented one. Usually, such violent upheavals happen in reaction to some other catalyst: war, exploitation, death. The years after 1992 were no different. A true underdog scenario unfolded, an us against them story the well-dressed reporters could deploy without injecting their biases. It was the Earth's first fully external battle. That gave it a power few other things could match. America had the systems in place for upheaval. Its burgeoning capitalist society already contained the components for finance-based wars and cutthroat company combat. The war on anomalies presented opportunities for the morally inclined and self-serving alike. Products were sold that could, proven or otherwise, protect against certain supernatural phenomena. Among them were the famous Prisma cloud cutters and cyclogenerators that still saw use decades later. But the greatest commodity were the armies and posses that formed in the heart of towns all over the nation. Many of these groups were short-lived, but others concatenated to bolster their strength, or were enfolded into growing startups that made private security their business model. This was the age of the NAPD, but it was also the age of Phenoteam, the Freeholders, the Fence Folk, and many, many others. Some of these institutions would die as they were outcompeted or absorbed by others, and some were simply wiped out by the cascade of deadly phenomena. Soon, it was clear that these institutions did more for the people than their own governments. It was a collective realization built over years of evidence. When the seat of power shifted, there was no violence. When private sector became public, it was like it already had been, because it was. The Pigeonhole Foundation came later, but still rose on the coattails of a turbulent social hierarchy. Unlike the NAPD, it presented itself as a solely research and social outreach organization, one part laboratory, one part charity. It was maintained by its namesake, Professor Pigeonhole. Honourable men manage honourable companies, and so the Pigeonhole Foundation became widely respected for its transparency and trustworthiness. The Pigeonhole Foundation relied on the NAPD to enforce the safety of its customers. The NAPD relied on the Pigeonhole Foundation for the technology that would allow it to enforce safety. It was an elegant system, all the more surprising in that it hadn't gone awry. No, Victor and Oslia had no complaints about the power-sucking Pigeonhole Foundation or the ever-watchful NAPD. It was the things that made those elements necessary, things on official news channels and new radio stations and in mirrors and dark hallways and the middle of the road in broad daylight, that they hated. It was the roots that killed, or the fire that spoke, or the walls that fed. It was the things that should not but did, both deleteriously and without shame. And so life became one enormous compromise. It would start on an early August morning. Victor woke up from his dream of red forests and slid his way out of bed. He always looked around after he stood from his dream, and his movements were that much slower, that much more cautious than they would have been otherwise. He poured himself a glass of orange juice that he didn't know the brand of, and ate a protein bar that he did know the brand of. Sometimes he had a headache by the time he threw on his coat and made his way to the ground floor. Most days he would not. This was most days. As he exited his house, he had the unmistakable sensation he was tripping over something. He attempted to steady himself, but there was nothing to steady. He hadn't tripped, and there was nothing around to upset his balance. Despite this, Victor felt like his world was still tilting. It was a feeling with a beginning and an end, a sensation that he had been fine and was now rushing towards an uncertainty that would end in a harsh impact. But this unfamiliar feeling transitioned seamlessly into a headache, and the oddities faded like dust in the air. Victor did not understand what had happened, but he understood headaches. He attributed the event to some new kind of migraine, and continued on. Behind him, his house stood sentinel. There was a creak of wood, a screech of metal, a writhing of pipework, and then it was still. It would end by late September.
Measure the drip.
4 centimetres. It had been 4 centimetres the entire day. EC001 was behaving itself. Or maybe it was mad, or asleep, or had no control over measurements at all. Victor didn't think about these things. He took a sip of the decent but not exemplary coffee they stocked the break room with. He could keep typing 4, he decided. Typing 4 wasn't that bad a gig. He wished he had a book, though. Say what you will about 1992, and he said quite a lot, but it had done wonders for the literary world. The addition of new sights, sounds and sensations necessitated entirely new vocabulary. This engorged dictionaries, giving the poets and professors of the world new toys to play with. Book sales didn't necessarily increase, but books themselves grew bolder and more experimental. Non-fiction and fiction began to blur, because really, what was the difference anymore? New genres emerged: natural, contranatural, in vitus literae, ex vitus literae, and so on. Some of these stories would tell of worlds which still held to their normalcy. Other books indulged in phenomena to provide truly eccentric plots, images and ideas. Some people read to escape, others read to experience. Victor could have gone for either. He was reassessing his desire to measure the same result continuously. EC001, he thought, if you can read minds, change it once. Give me something to think about for the rest of the shift. In his boredom, he entertained new scenarios. He thought about what would happen if he quit his job, or what would happen if he performed exceptionally well and got a promotion.
Measure the drip.
4 centimetres. Hell, like he'd ever be promoted based on his ability to recognise numbers. If he wanted change, he needed to cause it himself. He idly entertained altering his outlook on the world. What if he cared about some things more? What if he cared about other things less?
Measure the drip.
4 centimetres. He'd always known how much of his job revolved around this anomaly, but now he thought about how much his attachment truly relied on it. He decided that if the length of the drip did change, he would care about EC001.
Measure the drip.
2 centimetres. Holy shit, Victor mouthed. He drew a few glances from closer co-workers, but they turned back in the absence of context. He stared down the new number. The thoughts came quickly and in paralysing force. It couldn't have been a coincidence. No, here was proof of the supernatural world reacting to him. He had seen and read and responded to. He had more say in reality than he had ever known. The thoughts cooled to lukewarm fervour. Skepticism began to creep in. Why him? Surely someone else had been bored. Maybe he hadn't encouraged the change at all. Perhaps the change had encouraged him. Or maybe it was coincidence after all. His dad used to say the only difference between causation and chance was repetition of data. Victor tried again. Okay, EC001, he thought. I acknowledge you. Can you change it again? Or, wait, keep it the same for the next 5 measures, then change it again. I'll know we're communicating.
Measure the drip.
2 centimetres. Victor waited.
Measure the drip.
2 centimetres. Victor waited more anxiously.
Measure the drip.
2 centimetres. Victor's anxiety manifested as a silent, nervous drumming of the fingers.
Measure the drip.
2 centimetres. Had he miscounted? This was the one, right?
Measure the drip.
2 centimetres. No, wait, it was supposed to be this one. Was it still too early? He'd lost track.
Measure the drip.
2 centimeters. It had definitely been 5 measures already. This wasn't going to happen. Victor's anxiety deflated into disappointment. He slumped back in his chair. Maybe he would tell Oslia about what happened today. It had definitely made an impression on him. Not for the first time, he wondered where she worked and sat up to look around for her. That was how he noticed the screens of the other co-workers.
Measure the drip.
47 centimeters. He couldn't believe his eyes.
Measure the drip.
678 centimeters. He stared dumbfounded at his own screen. 2 centimeters. It kept being 2 centimeters. He looked around and saw consistent readings of 678 everywhere but his own desk. Someone he was reading from looked back at him. Victor broke eye contact and stared back at his screen. The person did not turn away.
Measure the drip.
0 centimeters. There was nothing. That wasn't possible. The screen was showing... Victor looked at the display of EC001. It was gone.